This is Eric Rutan of Cannibal Corpse. You are listening to the Scars and Guitars podcast with Andrew McKay Smith.
G'day everybody and welcome to the show. My guest is Robert Saylor. He is an Associate Dean for Evaluation and Assessment, Associate Professor of Theology and Culture, and Executive Director of the Centre for Pastoral Excellence and the Lilly Endowment Clergy Renewal Program at the Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. Robert is also an author and a theologian who specialises in the intersection of faith and modern society, covering pastoral sabbaticals, theology of the cross, and religion's role in today's culture. I have been looking to have someone like Robert on the show for a long time, and it is with great thanks to Steve Von Til from Neurosis for the introduction. Now, it's tempting to say that Robert is a different guest from what you're used to, but that simply isn't true. Just keep a few things in mind. I was the first journalist to reach out to Stuart Anstis, who blew the lid off the popular narrative, all the bullshit surrounding Cradle of Filth, and I'm the only person to interview Trey from Morbid Angel's mother, and some of the information that she shared is that Trey grew up in a deeply Christian household. So there you go. And of course, regular listeners will know that across 800 other episodes, you've become familiar with my technique of allowing the guest to broach topics across all social, political, and religious contexts. Now, this chat, it goes well beyond typical discussions of faith. It's an exploration into Robert's path to spirituality, ministry, his scholarly work in theology, and much more. I'm very excited to share this with you, so here he is Robert Saylor.
Nice to meet you, man.
Yeah, likewise. It certainly looks like an academic's library behind you there.
We create chaos wherever we go. It's let me try to adjust this lighting here, but that's I'm at my home library now, but I'll head into the office later. Whereabouts are you based?
Gold Coast, which is just a bit further south of Brisbane, the capital of Queensland.
God, it's I was just in London, and I met up with a friend of mine from around the Sydney area, Lloyd Swanton from the Next. I don't know if it's a jazz trio.
The Next, yeah, fantastic outfit, great, yeah.
Yeah, they were in London, and I've known Lloyd for a while now, and oh man, that's just transcendent stuff.
Oh, it is. You're right. Yeah, it's a sort of music that I often put music on, like the Next, in the background when I'm studying or going through things or even writing, and it doesn't interfere with my writing. Anything else apart from that type of jazz and classical music, though, interferes terribly. So I've got a real appreciation for the Next in that way.
Yeah, and they really something that I always appreciate when they perform live is just, you can talk about how the music is structured in an improvisational way, but it's really the textures when they perform live, right? Like, especially the piano player, Chris, the way he's hitting the keys, like the way his sort of hand is muting certain things, like there's a lot of textual variety when they play live that I really noticed this time.
Yeah, they remind me of musicians that are able to have a conversation with each other using scales and modes rather than the English language. That's what it reminds me of a lot. Now, I'm a musician, right, but I know jack shit about most scales and modes, to be honest with you. I've tried, but my brain just doesn't work that way. I have to play everything out, and I've done a lot of improvisation in that way of just hitting the wrong note and sliding into the right one, this sort of thing. But I listen to those guys, and there's no room for that there. It's like what the Mr. Bungle bass player does, Trevor Dunn. He gets involved in a lot of that.
Dunn, yeah.
Yeah, magnificent bass player. And his playing is sort of lost, I think, on most people in the rock scene, because he really can play that modal jazz stuff as well.
I actually I'd heard the Mr. Bungle records, but the first time I saw him play live, it was actually with some John Zorn ensembles. Yeah, like that kind of. And then I go to the Big Ears Festival every year, and he has a trio that he has. What's it called? Trio Convulsant. Yes, with Barry Howerson and so on. But yeah, and that was all upright, right? So you're right. He's just I mean, he's thinking on a theoretical level, but also I remember from that performance the way
Yeah.
he'd hit on the upright, he'd get into the positioning and then just like come across hard like this instead of just the pick, slide across. It's amazing.
Yeah, he's got huge whatever the muscle is across here with Trevor. Sorry, here you can just see it. It's just used to stretching across, and I think the drummer's name is Dan Weiss, if I'm not mistaken, who's just magnificent as well. I have had a conversation with him, but it was a fairly short one. I'd love to have a chat with him again because he's a huge extreme metalhead as well. But he only just does the jazz stuff as his musical manifestations live and everything else. But he'll often play this stuff wearing a obituary T-shirt or what have you. It's
yeah, it's just a lot of natural theoretical and actual crossovers, not just theoretical. Like Tyshawn Sori, the drummer that just I think he just won a Pulitzer Prize for a suite he composed. But he's plays with like Vijay Iyer and that sort of thing. He's I saw an interview with him, and somebody asked him, what influences you the most drumming wise, and he said Meshuggah. Like he immediately started listing like Meshuggah tracks and like just kind of this encyclopedic knowledge of technique and so on. It's like people aren't bound by categories anymore.
No. Have you met Thomas before? Thomas Harkey, the drummer in Meshuggah?
Oh no, I haven't.
No, he's a tremendous fella. I've interviewed him once, and he's just one of those guys who seems to be able to have a conversation at that level, musical level, but he's the sort of bloke you feel like you could invite over to dinner to a family barbecue or something like that as well. But with this tremendous musical knowledge that he's got, so very multifaceted, probably underplays his contribution to music, I'd say.
Well, I'm glad Steve connected us. You interviewed him? Is that how you met him, or you known him for a while?
No, I know him through. It was just the interview. David Brenner from Earsplit PR sent me the promo, and I know David over email, and you know how it is. I've been doing this for about 8 years or so now, and I love Neurosis, so I quite like what he's doing with Harvestman as well, particularly the new one that he's doing, the Triptych series that he's got going on at the moment. I do ayahuasca. I go on the journeying and the shamanic circles, and the last one I did, I listened to some of his stuff coming out of it, and it was really helpful. So I just expressed that to him. He may not have had that feedback before, but that's how that's its role in my life, if you like. That love for Neurosis, then it switched over to Harvestman, what he's doing there. But we had. The best way to describe it is an off-the-record chat afterwards, and I spoke to him for a couple of hours, actually, and tremendous fella, and I was talking to him about how my faith in Christ and Christianity has been strengthened through ayahuasca, which is quite the opposite to what a lot of the propaganda out there is talking about it being demonic and what have you. But I mean, I've seen and felt things that have been absolutely tremendous. A reawakening. I've always been Catholic, never dropped the Catholicism or the Christianity. The kids are all baptized. They go to a Lutheran school. Never lost my faith is what I'm saying. But because of my journeying with ayahuasca, I've basically been instructed to undertake theological training. Quite, as I say, quite the opposite to what I imagine a lot of people think you may get in ayahuasca, which is a trip to somewhere else. But I was shown.
I love that.
Yeah, I was shown in previous lives that I was in one of them in particular. I was like a wanderer and preaching the gospel, if you like, and I hadn't finished my work from them, so I had to continue on with part of that work in this lifetime as well. But along with, and here's the challenge for me, Robert, is along with everything else that I do. So I don't know where I'm going to fit everything. I gave up alcohol ages ago, so I don't have to worry about hangovers. But I talking to Steve, and he mentioned you, and he started talking about how he was introduced to you, and I said, look, I've been looking to have somebody like you on the show for a long time, because I'm part of my process is to demystify Christianity and its role in our lives as extreme metal fans. Because as you probably will bloody know, there's this big, I guess you'd call it, people see it as a paradox, and they can't reconcile the two, but I just think that's garbage. It's everything is an artifact of God, and extreme metal, of course, is as well. And I've got mates that are in the have previously classified themselves as Satanists and all the rest of it. I don't care what philosophy somebody follows or preaches or what have you. If we can connect on this basis through the music, this is God working through us. And you listen to that music anyway. These, my good mate Jamie from Dimmu Borgir, and I mean that's music that might have a satanic core, but that's uplifting to people because they listen to that and it gets them going in life. And I try to explain that. And just to drill it back to your question about Steve, it was so heartening to hear that there was somebody, particularly of your standing in the community, your academic background, and the way in which your faith has evolved, from what I understand, certainly from what I've read and what I've listened to you online on the YouTube, some of the YouTube clips that are out there, how you evolved from the Protestant faith into the Orthodox side of things as well. So where you want to take this from here, mate, is entirely up to you. Really, I guess that's just the preamble, the introduction there. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that all sounds great. You've got me thinking. You've got my mind going in like 3 or 4 different directions. I'll try to see if I can pick one and stick with it. No promises. But I think a lot of what I'm thinking about are the ways in which we can talk about the impact of technology on how we make music, how we consume music, and so on. And there are negatives maybe, and I'm old enough to where sometimes I get nostalgia for older modes. But one thing that I think might be behind a new sort of opening to the ways in which more extreme metal, even like sort of black metal type stuff, can coincide with spirituality, including more ancient forms of spirituality. I think part of that actually has to do with the fact that music is much more accessible now online, so that people don't have to take the marketing for it. You don't have to take someone else's word for it. What I mean is, I think part of the impact of the internet is that it allows people to do a lot of their own self-discovery, and so someone can come upon I'm thinking about Sun, for instance, whose music I really, Steve O'Malley in general, just a lot of his projects. If all I had was, if it were 25 years ago, I don't know, 30 years ago, and all I had with a band like that was sort of the presentation through magazines or propaganda or so on, the aesthetic might be such that it's like, oh, that's not an aesthetic I can jive with. But now, since I could just simply click on a track and have that sonic experience, actually get the music itself apart from the controlled aesthetic presentation, then it allows people to sort of form their own conclusions, and not even just to see what the music does to them. Like, how does it speak to them? Sun's music really speaks to me. Wolves in the Throne Room, right? Is our other band. They just like hit me on a certain level.
Same.
So I think that's part of it, is just kind of the new freedom to discover. I also think, theologians are talking a lot now about what does it mean. It's not like we can just turn back the clock on and go back behind modernity and the impacts of modernity. And there are a lot of reasons why we wouldn't want to, right? Modernity's like anything else, is a mixed bag, including a lot of good. But when you look at the impact of humans upon nature, the environment, the way in which the world is, our ability to live and thrive in the world is threatened through climate change, that sort of thing. Any sort of resonance that we can find between what does it mean to live in the world in what I would call a graceful way, coming out of Christian theology, and then the kind of conjuring that like Steve's music does, Wolves in the Throne Room does, Panopticon, like these bands that are on the one hand embodying some of the harshness of human technology, but also there's a yearning in there, right? Like for a different way of walking on the earth and being on the earth. I think there's a lot of deep spiritual resonance there. Like those are 2 things on my mind as to what might be going on in terms of some of that connection.
Yeah, that's a good point, that one there. But what about for you? Where did your journey? Let's just start with the musical journey, because that's what just about everybody listens to my show because of I think realistically everybody would listen to my show from the musical standpoint. So let's start there. What got you into? And if I'm wrong in saying this, in terms of it's not quite extreme metal that you get into, but the types of metal that you get into, how long have you been into them, and what got you involved?
Metal's so I started more on the punk side of things. Really, and that was, I don't know, that was like late middle school, early high school. I grew up in a small town in Southern Illinois here in the States, and it's actually, maybe 10,000 people, but it actually is a minor footnote in the history of punk rock in the US because there's a guy who basically had a garage and really cool parents. He started a punk band. He was listening to a lot of like Dr. Strange record stuff. 88 Fingers Louie. Bull Weevils were a big band in that scene. And the way this town sat, it was on the highway in between a lot of major cities in the Midwest. Chicago, Columbus, on the way to Philadelphia, headed south, that kind of thing. And so this dude basically got the word out to labels in Chicago, on the East Coast, and so on. It's like, hey, if you've got bands driving across the Midwest, if they want to stop off in this little town called Olney and play a show, you get gas money, you get beer money. And a surprising number of bands took him up on it. So in this little sort of farming community, 10,000 people, I grew up going to shows with 20, 30 kids in a literal garage with, some really, really solid punk bands. And I think that channeled a kind of energy for me in terms of, enjoying the music itself, but also just, I'm someone that actually really loves occupying questions as much as I like settled answers, right? So when I say that I was into the punk lifestyle, looking back on it, part of what I was really into was like the tensions in the punk lifestyle between consumerism versus anti-consumerism, like purity of identity versus identity that is kind of open to all. You know what I mean? Like, as long as punk's been around, there's been this question of, oh, what's really punk? Is that really punk? Or are you really living the punk lifestyle? And people can either get really annoyed by those questions, or they can be like, no, those are actually kind of the right questions in terms of just navigating life. And then from there, I think, so that's step one of three. Step two, actually, I think, is that same kind of spirit led me actually for a while into more contemporary classical, like 20th century classical, like Goretzky, Arvo Pärt that I've written on, and so on. And even though like sonically that's a far removed from punk, I'd never really been into classical before because it seemed very staid and measured to me. I don't feel that way about older classical stuff now, but at the time, like late teens, early 20s, it's like classical doesn't speak to me. But I discovered Pärt, I discovered Goretzky, I discovered Taberner, like some of these others, and they're there's kind of that outsider aspect to it there. And those two things together, to answer your question, probably led to me discovering whole sides of metal, I'd say in my mid 20s or so. So probably in my mid 20s, I went from being what I would consider sort of punk in my vibe to a lot of my consumption is progressive metal, some extreme metal. I'm thinking about ISIS. I'm thinking about Wolves in the Throne Room. I'm thinking about, Neurosis was always in and around. I sort of rediscovered Neurosis through Steve's solo stuff, but Sun was big. Boris, those are just some of the bands where, those two things came together, I guess is what I'm saying. Like kind of punk energy was sort of the experimental outsider symphonic stuff. Merzbow eventually, like those, that sort of thing where it's like there's composition happening here, but it's happening in this tension between creative spirit and hunger at how fucked up things can get.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. But what about your theological training then, or your training in ministry, I should say, frame it that way? Did you find that, like, put it this way, did you come into any of your lectures with the Neurosis t-shirt on and people sort of looked at you sideways? Did you ever have any of those moments?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's It's funny, and everything that I just described is happening in parallel with my theological training. It was like right around the same time that I discovered punk rock that I discerned that maybe I wanted to be a pastor. I was Lutheran at the time, so I go to college on a pre-seminary, pastoral track. I go to seminary basically right out of college. I end up sticking around, and while I'm working in some small churches, I do my first PhD in theology, and so all that's happening in tandem, right? And your question, theology is a big place, just like music is a big place. But I sort of immediately that same tension of, okay, I'm training to be part of an institution, but it's an institution, like in this case, the Lutheran Church, that isn't, it's in flux, right? And people have this sense that it's like, okay, there are some more contemporary questions that aren't being addressed here. And not just me, but I'd say a lot of my colleagues who are training for the ministry, a lot of them were attracted to some kind of what I would call, for lack of a better word, like outsider kind of art, like something that seemed outside the mainstream that they could find. And that wasn't always music, but yeah, I mean, I think what might surprise people is that when I would come into those settings being like, yeah, I like sort of extreme metal. I like some of these kinds of voices and experiences. It actually didn't strike people as much of a contradiction as they might think, because I think there was a lot of people who were like, we really need to live in this contradiction for a while.
You're not wrong. I've experienced that too. I work for the Uniting Church, which is a branch of the Protestant faith here in Australia. So a combination of the Presbyterian, Methodist, and Congregational churches, they combine, similar to the way that they did in Canada with the United Church. So I'm a content creator and journalist that works for them in the Queensland Synod, and our general secretary at the time, a lovely lady called Heather. They're only in there for a period of time, a tenure, if you like, but she thought it was hilarious that I interviewed satanic bands. And I didn't get any opposition whatsoever. In fact, I got quite a lot of people at work in the Synod who listened to the podcast and who enjoyed the chats. Now, I come from a Catholic background, okay, and I distinctly recall having to hide Deicide albums at home. And my mother's Irish Catholic and was staunchly so through the 80s and 90s. And then there was that. It happened in the States as it happened in Australia too, with the pedophile scandals and the like, and it just smashed a lot of people's faith in, not in God, but the institution of faith apart, particularly the Catholic faith. And I had, my best mate, his mother was used to write music for the Sydney Diocese, I think it was at the time, or maybe Broken Bay Diocese, one of them anyway. And then there was an issue there with that where she wasn't going to get recognised for writing, and I think she ended up stepping away. And there was this big, huge Catholic diaspora as a result of that. And I'm a part of that. So whilst I've never converted to any other denomination, I'm still Catholic. I subscribe, or I'm very much a part of the Protestant faith through the Uniting Church these days, and I just haven't found any of that opposition there. And I think you've addressed part of that in some of your comments there by saying that I think a lot of the people that are drawn to the Protestant faith these days recognise that it's not that it was incomplete before him, but it's more complete by adding in these new things. And a lot of those things is an appreciation for what we broadly call subversive culture. There are artifacts of Christ in subversive culture.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, and I mean, I'm always hesitant to say this because I grew up among really, really good people and in a really good church. I mean, I'm grateful for that. I also grew up, this is 1980s middle America. Church, for the most part, in my small town, was very much part of this larger edifice of be a good person, be a good citizen, be a good student, be a good worker, go to church. In other words, church was very much kind of a brick within the wall of the American dream, rather than any sort of sense of a challenge to that or a questioning of that. And I mean, again, I don't want to knock that and say that people's intentions are bad or that they weren't living out their faith well. I'm just saying that for all sorts of sociological and historical reasons, that was a moment in which church was basically presented as, it's almost like the religious I don't want to say veneer, but it's like it's the religious section of what it means to be a good American and a good person. Any sort of subversive sense of, no, actually, this is meant to be disruptive. This is meant to question the American dream. This is meant to question what it means to live a good life. That just wasn't really part of the mix. I had to go and study theology and realize, wow, there have been various times, including all the way back in the early church, where this Christian thing wasn't part of. It wasn't first and foremost how you be a good citizen. It's like, no, there's a danger to this. The early Christian martyrs were executed on the charge of being atheists. That was the charge that was brought against them, and it's because they would not give proper civic obedience to the gods, the Roman gods. And the ancient, I can go off on this a long time, so stop me. But I mean, the civil religion of ancient Rome and the places where Christianity emerges is such that, I mean, they didn't really care what you believed inside. What mattered was going through the proper civic rituals so that the gods would continue to bless Rome financially, militarily, and so on. And Christians wouldn't do that. They wouldn't even go through the motions of offering just a pinch of incense to the local gods. And so when they were executed on the charge of atheism, and a very particular kind of atheism, saying, no, our religion actually doesn't fit into this broader civic religion. It doesn't fit into this broader picture. God is both larger and more dangerous than that, the God that we worship. Mm-hmm. And the martyrs were willing to die for that. And the more I've really not only thought about that, but tried to get that inside me. It's like, look, atheism, the lines between atheism and Christianity are actually, it's not a simple line. There's all sorts of things that Christians are called to disbelieve in. There are all sorts of gods and conceptions of gods that Christians are called to disbelieve in. And so when I'm listening to, deicide or bad religion or, Meshuggah's got some, harsh stuff to say about religion. Even I venture over into Insomnium or Rotting Christ or something like that. It's like, yeah, I mean, there's something native about this anger towards a theology or a church that is misrepresenting God for the sake of power, political gain, whatever. That's actually baked right into the Christian thing from the beginning. And the earliest martyrs died in exactly that spirit.
Yeah, you raise a very good point there. Just the last one there. I just had a chat with Glenn from Deicide in the last fortnight. And I know he's Sicilian heritage, so I know he grew up in a Catholic household. He confirmed it. I didn't know for a fact, but I said, did you grow up with the Catholic artifacts, such as fish on Friday? We certainly did, and going to church every Sunday. And he more or less confirmed that was the case, because he said his mother, who was Lutheran, funnily enough, was a Sunday school teacher. So I've often said that if God was alive, he'd be a Deicide fan. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a great author, Meryl Westphal, who wrote a book, Suspicion and Faith. I don't know if you know Peter Rollins' work, but Peter Rollins has this whole. Yeah, he's a contemporary Christian author, but he used to do a thing called Atheism for Lent, and he got it from Meryl Westphal's book, and the book is about it's about Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, Feuerbach, all of these sort of major voices in atheism and suspicion from the 19th and 20th centuries. And what Westphal says, it's like, look, Christians ought to be reading these guys for Lent, because in the same way that the prophets in ancient Israel would sort of call out Israel's practice of its own religion, saying, look, you think about Amos, right? It's like, yeah, you're doing all the ceremonies, right? But what about the poor? What about the widows that you're trampling on? In the same way that the prophets would call out the practice of religion when it deviates from what God wants, we read someone like Nietzsche, let's say on resentment, and say, look, as a Christian, when have I been guilty of sort of weaponizing my faith in order to, or Marx, right? Like, when has not just my church writ large, but, I want to pause for a second and say something here. You mentioned my becoming Orthodox.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've really tried to onboard since I've been Eastern Orthodox these last 4 years or so is that whenever I talk about the evil out there and the injustice out there, it's got to start from within. You know what I mean? In other words, like I can start complaining about the church in any given moment and saying, oh, it's supporting injustice, or it's it's not keeping up with the real questions. But what I'm trying to train myself to do is to be like, okay, but start with myself. Instead of like blaming the thing out there, how does this live in me? And so when I think about, participation in injustice, when I think about, settling for too easy answers, yeah, I can look I teach church history at the seminary, so I can look through instances of history or now and say that. But spiritually, I also try to like look within and be like, how does that start with me? Like, how do I participate in that? But anyway, like if you think about that as a Lenten exercise, then all of a sudden it's that same thing where it's like, it's not just the line between belief and atheism. It's also Christians finding value in voices that are calling out religion, including ours, calling out the church. Paul Tillich, the theologian, once said, I always kind of shock my students with this, but he lived at the time of like the Nazis, right? And where the German church was becoming fully Nazified. And he says in one of his books, there are multiple forms of Christianity to which atheism is superior. In other words, now he believed as a Christian that there were forms of Christianity that were superior to atheism, of course. But it's like, again, that line between belief and unbelief, it runs right through religion and says there are ways of practicing and believing that are death dealing. And there are other ways of practicing and believing, hopefully, that foster life. And disbelief can be a really helpful place to meditate on where that line goes.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I recall distinctly in my teenage years was learning that an active part of your Christian faith is actually questioning the faith. So actively questioning the faith. So you go through those moments where, God help me for the grace of God, but mentioning these sort of things. But when a parent loses a young child, this sort of thing, and they just find that, where is the work of God in this? And those are the moments where, reasonably speaking, somebody says, "Fuck you, God! What the hell? What the earth is going on here?" So, for you, did you ever go through that crisis of identity where you did question your faith?
Yeah. Hope does not come easily to me. Like, I'm not a particularly optimistic person by wiring. And now hope is different than optimism. But I mean, you're right. I mean, there, but for the grace of God, it's been less through personal tragedy.
Yeah.
And more, I haven't told a lot of people this story, but, and I won't get into all the details, but, about 8 years ago, I read something really horrible on the news. I won't even get into it. It related to a child dying. And it's one of these, like, it wasn't front page news. It was just, this horrible thing happened to a mother and child, and it went into the details a little bit. And I remember I live in Indianapolis. I was in Los Angeles doing something. Oh, and the night that this happened, I was at a gig. I was at a Tim Hecker, Ben Frost gig, like the, like really intense, soundscape, like ambient kind of music. And I'm walking back, it's about midnight, and I've been taking in this really intense sonic music. And I don't know, I think I'm actually staying on the Sunset Strip for some reason. So it's like passing by all the whiskey and all that shit. And I just have this existential collapse, man. Like, I just I can't stop thinking about this child and the mother.
Yeah.
And I can't stop thinking about, oh God, we live in a world where that happens. And I'm not a Calvinist to where I think that every single thing that happens in the world is it has God's direct fingerprints on it. So it wasn't even that wasn't my problem. It wasn't like, why did God do this? But it's like, why do we live in a world where stuff like that is even possible and could happen to any of us at any time? And even if it doesn't happen to me, the fact that it happens to anyone, like, how can there be that much evil and cruelty? It was like my version of like what we call the theodicy problem, right? How can God be justified in the face of all this evil? And I just remember that I sat down on the sidewalk in LA at 1 a.m. and I think I couldn't move for, I don't even know how long, man. Probably a couple hours.
Jesus.
Yeah. And I thought that was it. And eventually I just, what do? You just pick yourself up, you go home, you try to sleep, you get some coffee, which even that kind of taught me something. It's like, okay, what happens? What do you do the hour after the world ends, but that's an extreme version. But I tell that story because it's like, that's in me, like whenever, and it's not a spectrum. It's the other thing I want to say. It's not like when my faith is going really well or I have a really intense, good experience with my faith. It's not like I'm furthest from that moment, because I actually don't think that's how faith works. I think it's more like it travels side by side. Like, we just had Pascha, our Easter celebration in the Orthodox Church, which comes after a whole week of services. It's an amazing, beautiful time. On the one hand, I feel strongest in my faith during those moments. On the other hand, when I feel strongest in my faith, that haunting of doubt or of hopelessness is traveling right alongside it. And I just think to be honest, I don't know that I'd want it to be different. I don't mean that in a self-aggrandizing way. I'm just saying, somehow living in that fight. Like, I think faith is a fight. I think it's and I don't trust a faith that's not, for myself anyway. I don't trust a faith that's not a fight, because if I'm not fighting, then chances are I've settled for something. I'm deluding myself. I'm not paying attention. But no, I carry that kind of within me, and I think I'm trying to learn to value it and to live out my faith in God from that space, rather than try to get the kind of faith to where I don't have it anymore. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does, but you've mentioned we've talked about orthodoxy a little bit. I'd just like to ask you a question about that side of things. So you are a Lutheran pastor, if I'm not mistaken. So you've actually got that title, or have you had to renounce that title?
I gave that up when I became Orthodox.
Yeah. What was it about orthodoxy that drew you to
it? Yeah. It was a long process. I think the first few times I encountered Orthodoxy, I actually didn't like it very much. It's like, oh, these services are too long. The preaching's not good, and so I became a Lutheran pastor and then a Lutheran theologian. I taught at a Lutheran seminary. My first PhD was in sort of Lutheran theology, and which I really value. I value all of it. It was actually the art that kind of drew me to Orthodoxy originally. But the thing about being Protestant, and I actually wrote about this when I was a Protestant, is, Protestantism is the freedom to sort of mix and match from lots of different traditions. So I'd say for probably close to a decade, I was into icons, I was into Orthodox icons, I was into Orthodox chants, some of the prayer practices. But for a long time, it was like, I just add this to my Lutheranism, and that's part of the freedom of Protestantism. And I have a lot of friends that still feel that way. I'm not trying to knock it. For me, though, again, since this is a conversation partly about like extremes, right? It's when I really started digging into the stories of the saints. The best way I could put it is when I saw how the saints shaped their lives towards living out not only their faith in Christ, but actually sort of being patterned by Christ in a deep way.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you two examples. My patron saint is a guy, Moses the Black. He was a robber. He was a murderer. This is in Egypt. He's from Ethiopia, but he ends up in Egypt, hiding at first. He's hiding out at a monastery, but then the more he's at the monastery, the more the monks kind of get to him in a good way, and he becomes a monk himself. And he becomes this incredible spiritual leader of this monastery in Egypt. So many great stories about him, but he's there for decades until he's an old man. When he's an old man, monasteries would often get attacked by bandits, because they had resources and so on. Bandits are coming to this monastery, and all the monks are going to flee because it's clear that whoever stays is going to die. And Moses says, "I'm not going to leave." And they're like, "Why?" And he said, our Lord said, "Those who live by the sword shall die by the sword."
Yeah.
I lived by the sword, and now it's my time to fulfill this. And this was after decades and decades of repentance and service to the monastery. I mean, his bandit days were long behind him, but he still saw, it's like, this is the completion. This is the bringing of this full circle. And so that's one story, and an even more extreme story. And every time I tell this, I'll just let you react how you're going to react. There was a saint, Lucia, who was a beautiful young woman, but early on she decided she was going to devote her life to Christ. So she wasn't going to get married. She was going to be a nun. And she would have all these suitors come by and try to convince her, "No, marry us. And she would say, "No, I'm going to be a nun." And there was one in particular who was particularly aggressive in pursuing her. And finally she's like, "Why won't you leave me alone? What is it about me as to why you keep pursuing me?" And he says, "Oh, it's your eyes. They're so beautiful. They haunt me. I can't get over your eyes." The next day she shows up with a silver platter. In her icon, you see this platter, and she hands it to him, and on the platter are her eyes, which she plucked out. This crazy extreme story, right? And she's like, it's almost like she's taking Jesus' words, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. She's like, it wasn't even her eyes, it was someone else. It was her eyes causing someone else to sin.
Mm-hmm.
And she takes it and she makes it even more extreme, those words of Jesus. And my point with both of those stories is I realized what the saints were doing. This sounds weird to say, but in all my time as a Lutheran, if you had asked me, "What do you mean when you say follow Christ? What do you mean when you say follow Jesus?" I'm sure I would have had an answer, but looking back, I'm not even sure what I really would have meant by that answer. Mm-hmm. Because when I look at those saints, it's like, oh, follow Christ means do this thing that only makes sense for you. It doesn't make sense for anyone else. I mean, I want to be really clear about that. Not everyone should be maybe no one should be plucking out their eyes because of a suitor. It's not that everyone has to do what Moses did, but these men and women are having these prayerful, lifelong engagements with Christ. And in the end, their lives just sort of take on this Christ-shaped character. And that, all of a sudden, this is what it means to follow Christ. And so orthodoxy, just to bring it full, orthodoxy was like, I want to be in the same church where they are. Because here's the thing, at a certain point, when I was reading about this stuff about Moses, when I was engaging this, you've had experiences. Maybe you can understand this. I wasn't just reading about him. I mean, he was there. I'm like, oh, he's still here. Mm-hmm. Like through time, he's still alive in that sense, alive in God. And it's like I want to be in the church where he is. Both in a metaphysical sense, and then also a church that recognizes what it is that he did, and that's orthodoxy.
Yeah, you had a transcendental moment. I'd probably describe it as, and you had one of those moments where some of the chaos of life, if I can frame it this way, crystallized, and you saw where the next the next phase in your life was going to, probably hereafter. And I've had, just to diverge on the topic of Christianity for a moment, I was actually baptized into the Krishna faith as well, the branch of Hinduism as well. Because when I had a very significant crisis of understanding my relationship with God, it did lead me. It was a friend of mine who they never call themselves devotees. They're aspiring devotees, because you can never devote yourself entirely, and only someone with an ego would say they're a devotee, they'd tell me. So, but he's an older fella. He lived a pretty interesting and colourful life, to say the bloody least. Introduced surfing to the UK from Australia and a few other things, or one of the people. Anyways, this guy, and we've since had a falling out, funnily enough, because he's he's still got a bit of an ego, this silly old bastard, but that's life. But my point is, when I was journeying, I call upon I wear a crucifix, and I don't say Om Shanti, I always say Amen. And I always say the sacred names, the Hare Krishna mantra. I say that as well, and that's often in the back of my mind when I'm really deep in. I can hear that's going on involuntarily, and there were moments there where I've since been able to, when I say reconcile the two, I found a place for both. Okay, and they're not mutually exclusive by any means, according to me. So I hope that makes sense. I understand that I'd be called from most people in the church. I understand that and I get that. But look, I've journeyed deep, and I've had the Lord stand next to me in that process. And I believe that's actually what happened, because I've been thrust into some very, very difficult positions through the journey. It's not for everybody, as I'm sure you can appreciate. It is trans-dimensional to an extent, and you are in places that are very unfamiliar and sometimes, frankly, very scary. And if you don't have something to latch onto in those moments, when you really do need something, I think you could potentially even become catatonic. It's, as I say, it's
absolutely. It's funny. I used to, as an academic, I used to think that the best way to honor multiple faith traditions was to keep myself kind of at what I would call like an ironic remove from them. It's like, okay, I'm going to practice a tradition, but I'm not going to practice it too deeply, because there's all these other traditions out there, and I'm going to, I'm not going to go all in on one of them so that I can sort of stand back and see the whole, right? But what you're describing, that's not actually how you get at, A, that's not how you get at truth, and B, that's not actually how you honor other people. The way you honor something is to go deep into your own thing that you're called into, and with all of its particularities. So for Orthodoxy, that means fasting, liturgy, saints, all those things. And what's amazing is the more particular that I've gotten, the more I recognize and appreciate others who are going all in on their thing. In other words, I think I have a deeper appreciation for my Hindu friends, my Muslim friends, my friends that aren't so easily categorized. The fact what's going all in on one particular thing. And it's kind of like maybe there's an analogy to music there, right? Like if you can appreciate this. If you ask someone like, "Oh, what music are you into?" and they're like, "Oh, I like all music." And it's like, oh, okay, you're probably not a music fan, right? like if that's your first response, it's just, oh, I kind of like all of it. It's like, if you talk to like, I'm not trying to be like elitist, but if you talk to like a real music fan, it's like, oh, well, I'm really into metal. I'm really into, prog metal, scream metal, black metal, whatever. And on that basis, it's like, oh, but I also dig jazz. I also dig, I dig this composer. I dig this, rock or whatever. It's like, because they've gone all in and really learned one strand, on that basis that they know what they can recognize and appreciate about other things. I think it's kind of similar.
So it's that, I guess, it's the role of agnosticism in my life, which seems to serve a purpose. And you will not find a more devoted to the Catholic faith kid than what I was. And through a series of, I would call it heartbreak or what have you, but it gets beaten out of you at some point in time. This version of it that you have as a child, and then it morphs into maybe what it's really supposed to be, which is that through trial and tribulation, you develop your relationship to God. And I just haven't. I've just found a way to reconcile the two. And I'm not your God-fearing Sunday. I don't attend church on Sundays anymore, I must confess, and I haven't done so since the early 90s, Catholic Church in the early 90s. It's just life sort of took a different direction when I was a teenager and joined bands, and it's hard to wake up and go to church at 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. when you got a bloody hangover,
I know it well, man.
And part of that agnosticism that I talk about is by having, you're the first guest that I've had on like this, but I mean, what a fantastic guest you are to have on to introduce this topic to so many people out there who I believe grew up in the way that we did. They grew up going to church and having some sort of a relationship to God, but we are so, in this day and age, because of our access to devices, digital media, and you've got wokeism and a lot of what's going on with the left at the moment, and you see these protests, and I can't believe I saw. I mean, this is happening. Anybody can go onto Twitter and see this, but these people with blue hair and all the rest of it, these non-gendered people and all the rest of it, they're doing the Allah worship stuff. Have you seen that on campus at the moment?
No. Wow.
They're doing this stuff, and I'd ask them if they walked for 2 minutes in downtown Rafah in Gaza, what they think might actually happen to them. Okay, so it's one thing to deny. It's one thing to maybe walk or go off your path from God, but it's another thing to deny it completely. And that's my point in and amongst all of that, and to take on these what I describe as idolatry. Okay, and take on, and I'm saying that in defense of Islam as well, because these people wouldn't understand what Islam is at all. They just don't understand what it is at all. If they've got all the accoutrement, I call it, and the Z and the Zur and the pronouns and all the rest of it, and they're doing this thing here, I'm sure the average Muslim is probably mortified that they're doing that in the name of their religion. But it's what's your take on, I call it modern day leftism, very broadly speaking. There's a lot of names for it: Marxism, Trotsky. The Trotsky take on Marxism, which is continual revolution. Do you have a view on all of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. The Simone Weil, the philosopher, said, who was a Marxist in a lot of ways, but was also a Platonist and a Catholic in her own kind of unique way. She said, it's not religion, but it's revolution that's the opiate of the people. And I think the real challenge is that
so true. Yeah.
And you can have like these cathartic experiences, which I think increasingly are sort of packaged and sold to people. I'm thinking about like the Occupy Wall Street movement from a few years back, right? Mm-hmm. Which, whatever was good in there, I think a lot of people say, okay, that didn't actually like achieve any like real economic change, right? And I think part of it was because it became this, in a negative sense, it became like this festival, right? It became like, how inoculation works. It gives you just enough of the disease to where you don't catch the whole thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get just enough rebellion to where you don't actually catch real change, right? It's like, okay, we're going to give you an experience. You're going to go to, I went to a Rage Against the Machine concert one time, which, and it's like, okay, we're having this, we're for 4 hours, we're going to be like raging, tearing it up.
Hey, comrade.
And then literally on the way home, it's like, okay, stop at Taco Bell, get some food, go to work the next day. It's like, we had our rebellion, right? We had our catharsis experience.
They're all wearing their T-shirts made in sweatshops in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
And Nikes are all made by 8-year-olds in Bangladesh. Yeah. It's ridiculous.
And that's the festival, that's the theater. Like you're getting the veneer, you're getting the that's why I mean Steve's album, No Wilderness Deep Enough, like is it rebellious music? Sonically, it's not what we would picture as it's not the music you would play at a protest or something like that. But I hear that. And I've told him this, that I think part of what I love about his music is it's like you're using explicitly electronic means. Same with Harvestmen, same with Neurosis in its own way. You're using electronic means to conjure a spirit of what it would be like to be more connected to the deep rhythms of the world, of creation, of nature. And like, that's rebellion to me, right? Like, me living in that space and me sort of submitting to it shaping me and putting me at odds with the constant spectacle. I think a lot of what's going on around, in multiple, left, right, everywhere in between, is just, we're just bombarded with, at a neurochemical level and also at a soul level, we're just bombarded with this constant outrage. And it's all, it's all fucking monetized, man. It's all designed to get clicks. It's all designed to, I don't mean that in like a giant conspiracy theory way. I mean, we just know this, right? I mean, this is just how money is made in the internet age. Our attention is the product. Our attention is the commodity.
Yeah.
And the more clicks we give on our attention, then that's how the money is made. And I think that the damage that that's doing to our ability to not only sort of sit with ourselves, but sit with each other at a soul level, that's not the only thing going on with like all of the unrest and so on, but it's, I can't help but think that that's a lot of what's in the background.
Yeah. I tend to, certainly, as I was just on 70,000 tons of metal, the cruise that leaves from Miami and goes to parts of the Caribbean there. And
Nice.
Yeah, it was fantastic, mate. I went solo, actually. It was interesting on that front, going solo like that. But I had a job to do. I was interviewing as part of the media contingent. So I was actually very, very busy with it all. But one of the best things was you're able to sit down and have dinner and, I just introduce myself to random people or what have you, most of which were either South American or European or North American. I didn't meet a single fellow Antipodean there, fellow Australian or Kiwi there. So, but I was talking to the Americans about things, and the North Americans, I should say, Canadians in the United States, mate. And minus the accent, the actual issues that we were discussing, they were exactly the same. They were exactly the same. Cost of living, kids being shut out of being able to buy houses, cost of fuel, the inflation, the cash rate, these sort of things. It was like talking to somebody, my mates here, when we go down and have coffee and start talking about all that we think ails the economy here, just like a bunch of barflies, but substitute the beer for coffee, these days. And but talking to people there, and there's an issue now which isn't being addressed by any political construct, which comes down to what type of quality of life would you like to have. It's all about these movements, whether it might be climate change or justice for Gaza or what have you. And we've got 10 cities popping up around us. It's nowhere near as bad as what I see on Twitter, or X, I should say, is what's happening in San Francisco and other parts of the United States. But they're happening around us here too, which is just, I never would have thought that would happen here. But conglomerations of people living out of camper vans and tents and the like, and the current political paradigm doesn't address what's actually going on for them. And what are your thoughts on this? I believe that is affecting people's relationship with God as well.
I think it's, yeah. There's a lot there.
Why have you forsaken? Why have you forsaken me here? That's to tie it in a knot. God, why have you forsaken me here? I don't believe in you anymore. It might have been going on for forever and a day, that issue there, but it's just so pertinent now because digital media gives us access to all the corners of the globe and all of the issues that affect humanity.
Yeah, I mean, this is like going back to what I said before. I mean, I really am trying to practice. It's like before I launch into all the bad stuff that others are doing, like start within, like and here I mean that even in terms of the church. And I mean, I love the church. I mean, I teach at a seminary. I'm not a priest anymore, but I think most of what I do, I try to do on behalf of and in benefit to the church. So I say this out of love for the thing that I'm giving my life to. The church has a lot of culpability in, I'm going to say, getting distracted towards different kinds of agendas throughout history. And also just participation in evil, not just distraction. But I mean, you mentioned sex scandals, which of course is not just a Catholic thing, right? Like all sectors of the church, you get horrible abuse of children, it's financial malfeasance, and also selling souls to political causes, right? Like, to be a Christian is to vote this way, or to be a Christian is to, have this kind of politic. And as a result, I think people, especially in an age where they can fact check stuff, whether they do or not, they can get online, they can think for themselves. And the way I think that connects to what you're saying is, if the church no longer is a responsible witness to its own core story, which to me is, the life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ, and what that means as far as the call to love, the call to serve, the call to be with each other in a different way. If we lose sight of that story, it's not that people's hunger for story goes away. It's that they're going to find it elsewhere. And there are all these other competitors for, here's a way to structure your life. Here's a way to give life meaning. And I don't, in this case, mean like other religions, that have their own sort of core stories. I mean that more this vacuum to where people are going to cobble together sort of, left, right, distraction, entertainment. They're going to cobble together something, or they're going to try to at least, that gives life coherence and meaning. Because I really do think we need that as human beings. And if religion doesn't do it, something else is going to come into its place. And again, I say that out of a sense of, look, the church has some culpability there. It has some repentance to do in terms of how it's lost credibility around that story. But part of the reason why I think we need that story is because you see the intensity of the outrage and the emotion that gets attached to things, where it's like, wow, where's that anger coming from? Where's that intensity coming from? And I think it's misdirected energy from where that energy is supposed to go, which is, and for me as a Christian, I have a way of speaking that way. But it's, we have these fragments flying around, and these fragments get so much energy attached to them because that energy is sort of seeking out that whole, seeking out that coherent story. And for a lot of people, they just feel they've lost that.
Yeah. Do you feel that it could be as simple as people reconnecting with faith through going to church on Sunday mornings? Would that be a part solution?
Here's the thing about Sunday mornings. And I don't mean this as a criticism of anyone who doesn't go to church, but because I don't always feel like going to church on. I love the liturgy, and I have to drag myself out of, much less my kids. I gotta drag everyone out of bed on Sunday morning, and it's tough. But when I do that, I am sitting there wrestling with God in the company of people that I would not have picked myself. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's not me and my friends getting together. It's not me and my circle getting together. It's like, I'm sitting here now with people that have come to this place. God's brought them there. Life's brought them there. And if I'm actually going to have an authentic experience of God, I'm speaking for myself. If I'm going to have an authentic experience of God, it can't just be sort of in my own head with my own self-curated inputs, whether that's stuff I'm reading, music, or whatever. I've got to get confronted by this thing that's genuinely outside of myself. Let me tell you a story to illustrate. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great 20th century theologian, resisted the Nazis in World War II. He lived for 2 years at an illegal seminary, actually in Finkenwalde, Germany, before the SS shut it down. And he wrote this little book about his experience there called Life Together. And as the title says, it's about how do Christians do life together? What does it mean to be in Christian community? And he has this thing in there on confession of sins. And in the Lutheran Church, as you may know, unlike the Catholics, for the most part, especially in his time, individual private confession went away with the Reformation. All the confession was sort of corporate. It happened in worship. Everybody did it together as part of the liturgy. And Bonhoeffer, as a Lutheran, was actually arguing for bringing back private confession, in this case, confession of one brother within the community to another one.
Mm-hmm.
And when he's talking about why, he says, look, do a thought experiment on yourself. Ask yourself, pick the sin you're most ashamed of, the one you would hate to say out loud. And imagine, is it easier to sort of confess that sin to God silently in your own head? Or is it harder to say that out loud to a brother within the community? And of course, it's like, oh, it's actually harder to say it out loud to another human being. And he's like, why? God is perfect. Why? And other human beings are sinful. Why are you so much more ashamed to talk to a human being than you are to talk to God about this thing you feel ashamed of? It's like, because, long story short, we live in our own heads so often. Yes. It's like we think we're praying to God, but actually we're just sort of keeping it all inside. When we have to say it out loud to another human being, not only is that making it real in a certain way, but that realness and that discomfort actually could be a sign of the presence of God and not just us in our own head. So maybe that's an extreme version, but it's like when I go to church and I'm in community, it's like, okay, God is going to put people in front of me that are doing this thing way differently than I would, with whom I genuinely disagree. I wouldn't have chosen to spend a few hours with them. Some in my church I would, but some I would not. But that's what I need, especially, man, in this internet age where so many algorithms are only showing me stuff that I've told the internet I want to see, right? Yes. Yeah. Whether that's social media, it's like my whole world is getting curated narrower and narrower and narrower. Something as simple as getting my ass to church and being around people that I didn't curate or that an algorithm didn't curate for me. I need that to get out of my own head. So the answer is going to church like going to be the answer to everything? Probably not. But I do think getting out of our own curated headspaces and our own tighter and tighter boxes of what gets curated for us.
Yeah.
That I do think is going to matter more and more.
What led you to I've read your resume and I've also gone into some of the detail. I think it was LinkedIn it might have been, or maybe a university profile. But something interesting, there's a couple of things that stood out that I think listeners would like me to ask you about, which is that you've explored topics such as UFOs, conspiracy theories, but you've done so through the paradigm of their relationship to American Eastern Orthodoxy. And you've got some work coming out in relation to this. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a book it's coming out in a couple of weeks, as far as I know, on this movement called Death to the World, which is a great, for anyone into metal or zine, yeah, Death to the World is awesome. I'm a fan. I always want to say that, even though I do talk about some of the conspiracy theory stuff. You know, it's like I'm a huge fan of the Death to the World movement. A guy named Justin Marler, who actually was a guitarist on Sleep's first album, Volume 1.
Okay.
Yeah, so Sleep's guitarist. After that album, he kind of freaks out for existential reasons, ends up at a monastery, an Orthodox monastery in Northern California, becomes a monk. And while he's there, he starts a zine called Death to the World. And on and off, it's gone on ever since the early 90s. And it's like metal aesthetic, but with a lot of stories kind of like the ones I told about like Moses and St. Lucia, like some of these really intense stories of saints and faith and so on. And what the book is about, it's trying to tell that story with appreciation, but also to ask this question: if you have this sort of punk or metal energy of suspicion of the system, where does that go in a really helpful direction, and where does it go like in a wrong direction? I'll give you an example. I co-teach a conspiracy theory course at IU, and we talk about Alex Jones and InfoWars, especially after the Sandy Hook shooting. You know, it's part of the awfulness of life in the U.S. is we have all these mass shooting incidents, right, including often of kids. And this was elementary school kids dying. And Alex Jones, InfoWars, one of the things that really made his platform was saying, oh, this is a false flag operation. These are crisis actors. This is the government. And it's like, why are people so eager to believe that? Like, why did so many people follow that? And what I'm trying to do in the book is to say, there's stuff in there around COVID. There's stuff in there around just all these things in our life together. And it's like, if you have this intense suspicion of the system, which I do, and I'm talking about myself here, if you have this intense suspicion of the system, how does that get channeled in productive ways? And where can it go wrong in ways that cause you to believe and think and act in ways that really do damage? QAnon's another one, right? It's like QAnon did a lot of damage here. I know you had it in Australia too, but like in the US, it's kind of a factor in life here. So I'm using Death to the World, A, because I love it, but also as a way to think through, how do you spiritually channel this energy in the right way?
Yeah.
And the answer that I try to come to in the book is sort of along the lines of what I've been talking about, saying, look, it's got to start from within. Instead of locating the enemy out there, it's like, oh, it's the government, it's the Antichrist, it's the system, it's the Illuminati, the New World Order.
Yeah.
Whatever's true about that, whatever bits of truth there are in that, in the end, to me, it's really about spiritual warfare, if I can use that term. Like, we look to our own hearts and we ask, how is the system colonizing me? And what does it mean to get myself out of that? And I found, just for myself, and certainly in people that I see as far more spiritually advanced than I am, it's like when that's the battle that they fight, I'm going to use the word grace. They just deal with the world more gracefully. It's not that they aren't still critical where they need to be. It's not that they still don't stand up for what they believe in, but there's just a grace and a love that comes through that even makes the resistance far more powerful than just what we were talking about before, the anger and the spectacle. So that's what the book's about.
Mm-hmm. I'll have to read it when it comes out. I'm fascinated by it, but the fact that you're teaching a subject on the topic goes well beyond, because you only have to dive into X or any of the social media platforms, by the way, to see that there's a bunch of this stuff up there, whether it's 9/11 or the moon landing conspiracy, or the big one that keeps on coming up, of course, is JFK. And I know there's a lot of there's the magic bullet theory there, which is just bullshit. We know that. But Harold Holt, an Australian Prime Minister, went missing too in the 60s as well. I mean, Prime Ministers don't just go bloody missing. Something happens to them. And it's more, and you mentioned QAnon there, and I did have somebody on who was a musician, and they were brought on the premise of talking about their music, but they were way more into this QAnon stuff. And at the time, I just didn't really have my head around it, because I felt it was more of an North American artifact, and this was the first Australian that I'd heard talking about it, because they were big Trumpers, and you tend to find that they go down in those routes there. But they were talking about something called breadcrumbs or something, and I still don't understand that full. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of what QAnon does, it's really, in the class, we actually have people read analyses of QAnon from video game designers. And some of the best analysis comes from these video game designers, because it's like, okay, you have these really cryptic, mysterious drops, right? Like these they're tweets, basically, that come from the source called Q. And then the breadcrumbs, those become like the breadcrumbs. And if you're a hardcore QAnon enthusiast, you become known as a baker. Okay, you take all these breadcrumbs together, you piece together a narrative saying, oh, this is what Q is saying, this is what's happening, and you put that theory out on the internet to fellow enthusiasts.
Okay.
And then, it's like the marketplace of ideas. Whatever, you become like a QAnon influencer on the basis of how successful your theories are in attracting people. So it's like a video game. It's exactly. There's this notion that neuroscientists have called apophenia, which is our pattern-seeking ability, and that goes back to primeval times, right? It's like, okay, 3 people ate the red mushroom and they died. There must be a pattern between the red mushroom and dying, right? So like, we're talking cave times. And so we are pattern making machines brain wise. And so what QAnon does is it plays to that pattern seeking. It's like, okay, you gotta drop over here. You got this political event happening here. This politician made this hand sign. It's all coming together, and there's a real pleasure in that, right? It kind of strokes that apophenia part of our brain. But the problem is, yeah, it's all fun and games until people are storming the Capitol, right? It's all fun and games until somebody shoots their parent because they think the parent's a lizard person taking over, and this stuff's happened, right?
That's nuts. I know. Yeah. Look, I've had people accuse me of being a Trumper, and look, to be honest, I don't have a position one way or another on American politics outside of what I see with regards to the violence and the effect on communities. That's the only time I'll offer an opinion on the show, and the reason I do that is because I talk to so many people, and I think it's wrong not to have a view on these things because I hate when communities are affected adversely in that way. But I could care less if someone calls me a Trump supporter, by the way. There's nothing out there to substantiate it, but I've even had Reddit threads calling me a far-right lunatic or what have you. I mean, but that's when you get people who again, my view on these people is that they're lost, okay? They've lost community, so they find community online in Reddit forums. Okay, so you're talking about this pattern seeking. They go, right, if I accuse this person who I don't know, Andrew Mackay-Smith, of being a far-right nutcase, I'm going to put it on a Reddit forum. I'm going to get a reward, which is a like or an upvote. Okay, and that's now my community. And I can't help but notice that a lot of these people come from shattered families and broken homes too. They must come from their families are broken apart. And in most cases, they don't have that connection of God because they haven't had, in particular, a father around. And I'm not criticizing everybody for a moment that grew up without a father or what have you, okay? I'm simply saying what my observation, what my, principal research has discovered with a lot of these people. When I haven't gone down the rabbit hole with too many of them, by the way, so it's not a big sample group, but loss of community coupled with not growing up in a nuclear family and the absence of God leads to QAnon or this wokeism and this far left stuff as well. And it's a bit like the National Socialist thing and the socialist thing. That socialist word bloody is in both of them. And so, of course, they share common ground. I know that people on either side will argue to the death that they're completely different, but to the passive observer, you can't help but look at the extreme tendencies that are characteristics of both and go, it's pretty similar bloody ground because there's restriction of liberty. You're not allowing me to have a thought, to vocalize my thoughts one way or another. And just to tie it all up, it's one of the reasons that I asked about going back to church again, because the link to that too is, look, I've given up alcohol. I'm not abstaining for any reason apart from the fact that I just don't want to do it anymore. There's nothing religious or about God about it, although I like to think that it's part of my higher calling that I've done it as well. But if you go to church on Sundays, you're not going to get blind, drunk or pissed, as we say in Australia, on the Saturday night or probably the Friday night either, because you wouldn't have the energy to wake up at 7:30 to go to church at 8:30. It's not just going to happen. So, look, yeah, it's a bit of a social commentary that I think I've offered there, but I've just noticed there is that link between calling them the far right and the far left. I've just noticed that they share a lot more common ground than they'd ever care to acknowledge.
Yeah, I think you just said something important there. I just want to highlight that. Like, it's, when you talk about like not drinking, like for the reason of going to church or your higher calling or whatever, it's like, that's the difference between not doing something because it's a prohibition. And, prohibition psychologically only makes the thing more attractive, right? Like, oh, don't do that, as opposed to saying, no, I don't want to do that because it will distract me from the thing I want to do. Like the example I use, this is like the difference between freedom as defined as I can do whatever I want versus freedom as I want to be aligned with the higher good that I feel called to. It's like in ethics, we talk about that as freedom from versus freedom for. And the example I use with my students is I try to be a trail runner. I'm not great at it, but yeah, I've been trying to incorporate that more and more in my life. And it's like, look, we can define freedom as I can eat whatever I want. I can have 3 burgers, a beer. It's like, that's one kind of freedom. No one's going to tell me what I can and can't eat. But if I'm constantly eating horribly, then I'm not going to have another kind of freedom, which is the freedom to run on a trail for 3 or 4 or 5 miles in an enjoyable way and have that incredible rush and experience with nature, right? If I indulge my one kind of freedom, I'm not going to have this other kind of freedom. So what you're talking about saying, oh, I don't drink, not because it's like a prohibition, but because it's incompatible with this higher or deeper thing that I want. That's key, man.
Well, I'll share this with you. It was through ayahuasca that I was able to give it up completely. I'd done enough research about it to know that, and also too, you do this with a shaman, and the shaman was very clear that with ayahuasca, it's not a it's a roller coaster ride if you don't, but you've got to be very intentional with it. And one of the things that I remember asking, I didn't ask, it wasn't a throwaway line, but I'd been looking to abstain for a long time, about a decade, okay, because I was just tired of it. And look, just being Australian of Irish extraction, we tend to be able to bloody drink, unfortunately. Like I could drink I'm not saying I can get away with it now, but I used to be able to drink an entire bottle, and I couldn't drive a car, but I certainly wouldn't be rolling around pissed, and I could certainly wake up the next morning and function and deal with the kids and everybody else with no dramas. I recognise I'm not going to say that in itself is a problem, but it could lead to having a problem.
Sure, yeah.
And I thought, well, look, I've asked, and I still pray. I was always praying, and I always said, why is this attraction to this bloody thing? You get to our Thursday night after abstaining since Sunday, and it's like a roaring fire inside of you to go for the wine or the vodka. Vodka, in my case, was always the big one. But through ayahuasca, I was able to give it up. I feel like it's put me on a completely different frequency, but my take on all of that is that ayahuasca is a vine, so it works in conjunction. There's a couple of ingredients with it too, but ayahuasca is the active ingredient. They're all creatures great and small, all things on this earth are created by God. God has obviously put this here for us to discover, and I believe, provided it's working in tandem with faith, I believe you're going to be okay. Okay, and I think that's why I'm able to get such positive, in some ways miraculous results, is because it does work in conjunction with my faith. My intention is set to what my faith, everything is through that faith lens, if you like. So my question after all that is, do you have a view on psychedelics at all?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like, I think less in terms of categories, like, okay, this thing is automatically good, this thing is automatically bad, and more in terms of the way you've narrated it. Like, what function is it playing at this particular point in the journey? I don't have really any experience with psychedelics proper, like at least at that level. So I'm not. You're able to speak more authentically to it than I can. I think my outside question for myself would always be, is this helping the work or is it taking the place of the work? And I think what you're narrating is like it's helping the work, right? Like it's, you're wrestling, you're pulling things together, you're thinking about your faith and all of that, and this is a help along the way. I can see how for other people, and I feel like I do know some people like this, it's like they're talking about all the spiritual experiences they've had off of something, but when you listen to them, it's like, oh, there wasn't a struggle there. Like you're not, like it's not impacting your life, it's not impacting the thing. So to me, it's less a matter of, are psychedelics proper, good or bad? It's more the individualized question of, is this helping you along the way, or is this taking the place of the way? I don't know if that makes sense.
It does, but I can tell you, God, I mean, the experience that I had when I spoke to a mate from Connecticut, from near your part of the world there, when I say your part of the world, North America, about it, and on the show, and it was absolutely hellish, to be quite frank. I mean, to talk about having to work for it or what have you, or sacrifice for it, there were 2 or 3 hours, mate, where I could barely bloody breathe. And I mean, it was, and I had the visions that I was seeing was a bit like a stone being squeezed with lava and all this pus and disgustingness coming out of it. And it was God working through me, if you like, to rid me of this thing that I'd asked to be rid of, if you like. And God help me if anybody tried to do this stuff recreationally. I couldn't imagine because it was far from traumatic, because you also feel very safe and secure. And I think part of the reason that I do is because I do carry the faith. And I think there are a lot of people there do too. The circles that I mix in, they're mums and dads, military, police, people who have traumatic jobs, and they've arrived at a point where a lot of those people are, I wouldn't call them absence of faith, but they're not really open to having conversation about faith in the way that you and I are, I've got to say. But they're still not bad people, and they're still intrinsically good people. They're still raised in the grander Judeo-Christian tradition, even if they don't recognise that that's where maybe they got their values from. And I know that because I don't think their values are really any different to mine, and I am a card-carrying member, as you know. So, yeah, it'll be very interesting to see how the relationship between faith and these apparently miracle working psychedelics evolves. And I've already seen attempts to demonize them on Twitter. There's been a few people out there that have been trying to, and I've had to resist having to get into any sort of long discussions with them about things because I don't know what life path they're on. Some of them claim to be people of God these days and the like, but I think if you're a person of God, then judge, you shall not cast the first stone sort of thing.
I mean, two things from what you said. One, if we're talking about like kind of medicinal or therapeutic uses, like trauma is, and I'm no expert, but I mean, I have friends that work with, trauma and so on. That runs deep, man. Anything that can help on that front. I mean, absolutely. I mean, so 100%. And that's new territory. And then two, I think about it in terms of, maybe this is overly simple, but I think about Paul talking about speaking in tongues, and so his basic point was like, look, he wasn't saying that people weren't having really intense experiences of glossolalia. His question was like, what are the fruits of it? And I think what he meant by that in that case was, is this becoming just like your own private personal experience that kind of builds up pride, right? It's like, oh, I'm this spiritual person on this other plane. Or are you doing this so that you can sort of come back almost like a bodhisattva, right? You can sort of come back to the community and bring the community along and benefit everyone on the basis of who you are based on these experiences. That's not the only way to think about it, but one of the things I really appreciate about the Christian tradition at its best, it hasn't always lived up to this, but at its best, it's always said, look, you can have really deep, intense spiritual experiences, but at the end of the day, God's truth is for everyone. You don't have to be a learned scholar. You don't have to be a spiritual athlete. You don't have to be a virtuoso. Like the simplest peasant in the field might be closer to God than the high priest, reverend doctor, whoever, right? So it's like, this is for everyone. It's like a democratizing kind of influence. And so I think whether it's psychedelics, whether it's really any kind of intense spiritual experience, I'm like, okay, that's awesome. But is that making someone more prideful or more insular, or is it forming them in such a way that they're able to be for others and share the fruits of that?
Yeah. I'd say that from my experience, it's very much like the faith that we're both part of, in that you get a mix of all types. Honestly, you get some people that I think are in it to see how often they can do it, just because they want to rack up numbers, like as if there's any sort of there's some sort of a competition going on out there to see who can reach 100 journeying, 100 circles or what have you, which to me is just crazy. I mean, as I said, this is not recreational whatsoever. It can be extraordinarily difficult. The good nights are great, but it's more often than not, it's extraordinarily difficult, and it's helping you resolve things internally so as that you can get closer to God. And I know you often use the analogy that if you've got trauma and if you're feeling things at a very deep level and you still have your faith but you're struggling to resolve these things that are taking away from your joy in life, because I do believe we are meant to experience joy in this life. It's not just to be the metaphorical cross carrying all through life, but it's not a parable, but it's a story. Probably should be a parable, but the bloke who got stranded, like what was that Tom Hanks film, Castaway? Stranded, a rowboat magically washes ashore, and he goes, "No, I'm a man of God. I'm not going to get into the rowboat." And then some bloke in a speedboat comes by and says, "Hey, mate, come on in." He goes, "No, I asked God to save me. God's going to save me." Next thing, the military comes and he says, "No, the bloke in the speedboat said, you're here, mate. We're here to save you." He goes, "No, my God told me that he was going to save me. That's I have faith he's going to save me." "All right, mate." And then he dies, and he says, "God, why didn't you save me?" He goes, "I sent you a rowboat, the speedboat, and the bloody military, and you still didn't take my hand." And I very much look at ayahuasca in that paradigm.
Well, and two, we've talked before about sort of modernity and like more ancient patterns. Like, I don't know anyone. Yeah, I have a lot of friends who are doctors. I mean, and work in the medical industry. I don't know anyone that doesn't think there's something fundamentally broken about the medical complex. I mean, certainly in the United States with our insane healthcare insurance gaps, but even just sort of in modern Western medicine in general, for all of its goods, I think it makes total sense to me that future generations will look back and be like, "Oh, that was the time where people were really trying to recapture and synthesize other ways of healing in the midst of all of this." And that's just where what you're talking about. It's trial and error, it's science, it's testimony, it's people willing to be pioneers. If it turns out to not be good, that'll work itself out in time. But if it turns out to be good, then that'll just get incorporated into what healing is in the future.
Yeah. Look, I've taken up an hour and a half of your time. I feel like in some ways, I feel like we haven't even touched the sides, and we're just getting started. I mean, I'll put it out there now. I'd love to have you back on again. If I understand you're very busy and there's other things going on, but if ever you're keen to have another chat, I'm really down for it. And I think the people that listen to the show, I have people that are right into black metal, and they are. Just in this last couple of weeks, I received one message in particular. I should be clear. From a fella in Melbourne who was telling me that he still kept his faith as well, but he's a black metal musician. Okay, and he really likes the fact that I'm talking about these things on the show, and this is and now I've got a guest on where we are talking about these things. So, look, as far as I'm concerned, you have an open invitation anytime you want to come on the show and talk about whether it be metal or orthodoxy, Christianity, and our faith in general, and how it interacts with modernity and the societies that we both function in. Yeah, I'd love to have you on again.
Welcome, that man. It's this is flown by. I really, no, and it's. I think it relates to what we're talking about. There's a certain space that gets created, when we're talking about what happens within our soul when we encounter great art, which for us that includes metal, and then when we're wrestling with questions of faith. I mean, it's been a great space to dwell in for a while. So I appreciate you having me on.
Well, there you have it, a conversation with theologian, author, and academic Robert Saylor. I hope I can bring you more conversations with Robert in the near future. And just to round out a couple of points that I made in the introduction, I'm not suggesting that Robert is typical for the show, because he isn't. But the topics of conversation are where I've been wanting to take the show for some time now, but you have to get appropriate guests on to be able to do that. You can't just talk to anybody about the topics that Robert was able to cover very extensively. Hopefully, this chat is the first of many with Robert. So there you go. All right, check out all my other interviews if you're new over at scarsandguitars.com. Okay, that's it. My name's Andrew Mackay-Smith, and I'm the host of the Scars and Guitars podcast. Until the next one, it's a goodbye for now.